two households, both alike in dignity. In fair Verona, where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life, whose misadventured piteous overthrows do with their death bury their parents' strife. The fearful passage of their death-marked love, and the continuance of their parents' rage, which but their children's end naught could remove, is now the 2 hours traffic of our stage, the which, if you with patient ears attend, what here shall miss, our toils shall strive to mend. Ever heard of Romeo and Juliet? Well, I think at this point their story is common knowledge, even towards those who are not usually Shakespeare fans. That is, if you ignore the fact that William Shakespeare did not, in fact, write the story, but rather, the play itself was based on an old poem of the same name, albeit with some changes near the end, especially with the old poem being called The Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet. You would think that something like this would never happen in real life, right? Well, my dear viewers, you're about to be mind-blown when I tell you the story of the real Romeo and Juliet, who actually existed in Spain rather than Italy, and were far more successful when it came to their secret romance actually helping unite both their families. You could say that they are the real-life Romeo and Juliet, that is, if Romeo and Juliet shared a few more brain cells and weren't overdramatic idiots, but alas, such is fate. Before I tell you the story of the real Romeo and Juliet, I want to mention a funny little anecdote that happened while I was in university. As you probably know, COVID ended up screwing over a lot of classes at many schools, thus forcing the students to partake in mostly virtual online classrooms, and my school was unfortunately one of the many schools that was forced to mostly become virtual in that case. Anyways, one of my classic courses happened to use the virtual classroom setting, and we were talking about the poet Virgil, as he was the main subject of our course studies at the time. As our teacher was talking about Virgil and where he came from, she happened to mention Mantua as being his birthplace, and it immediately reminded me of Romeo and Juliet when I pointed out how the name Mantua was mentioned in Romeo and Juliet, as the setting took place in Italy and that Rome took place in a land that will eventually become known as Italy. My teacher actually confirmed that it is the same Mantua that Romeo and Juliet were planning to elope to had their plans been successful and they didn't kill themselves. Even funnier is that the moment I mentioned Romeo and Juliet, one of my classmates started to quote the opening lines of the Shakespeare play as a joke in the chat room, which I thought made for a good laugh. And yes, it was the same opening lines that I just quoted at the beginning of this video. Another interesting thing to note is that the teacher I had for my virtual course was actually the same teacher that I had for 2 of my previous classic courses, and I would have her again for my last course in my final year, which was based in Roman mythology. Yeah, I took a lot of classic courses as part of my major for graduating. Now, I know what you're thinking. Judging from the title of this video, you probably thought I was going to talk about Romeo and Juliet, considering the phrase star-crossed lovers actually came from the Shakespeare version of the story. Yeah, well, today is not what we are doing today. Today, I would like to talk about the story of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabela of Castille. And yes, the Aragon that Ferdinand ruled over is the same kingdom that Catherine of Aragon, who was the former wife of Henry VIII, came from. And in case you're wondering, yes, I am aware of the musical Six and consider it to be one of my personal favorites. So go check it out if you want. Anyways, before we talk about how they end up getting together and allowed their marriage to unify both their families and Spain, we need to lay down some background history first. To sum things up, Isabela was technically second cousins with Ferdinand thanks to their families having a shared ancestry through King John I of Castile, and because the Catholic Church had banned cousin marriages, things got complicated between them very quickly. Ironically, however, Isabela's father, John II of Castile, had arranged for them to get married once they became of age, but only because he wished to unify Spain through the marriage due to the various civil wars that took place around that time. Isabela also had an older half-brother named Henry IV of Castile, who succeeded after his father, who died in 1454. Unfortunately, Henry would prove himself to be a rather unpopular ruler, with his subjects both rich and poor seeing him as a weak and incompetent king, to the point of him being referred to as Henry the Impotent. The fact that he had marital problems with his first wife, Blanche II of Navarre, didn't make his reputation any better. Not only that, Henry and Isabella didn't exactly get along due to Henry seeing his sister, who was far more cunning and intelligent than she looked, as a potential threat to his power. The fact that he prevented her from leaving their estate as to not involve her in political affairs, even though her intellect could have potentially smoothed things over, didn't make things any better between them. As for Isabella's arranged marriage to Ferdinand, with her being 6 years old when it happened, it technically got broken off due to an incident involving Henry's alliance being broken off with John II of Navarre, who happened to be the father of Ferdinand of Aragon. Due to Ferdinand's uncle, Alfonso V of Aragon, dying in 1458, John II was then granted most of what remained of Alfonso's power, thus prompting him to break off the alliance with Henry, due to him believing that he didn't need Henry's help in maintaining his power anymore. Ironically enough, had Alfonso not died, Henry and John would have happily gone through with the arrangement, but alas, such is fate, and the marriage was quickly called off. Or so you'd think. Henry was still determined to make use of his half-sister, while also trying to find a way to gain more allies, and so he decided to have her be married off to John II's son, Charles of Viana. The moment John discovered the plot, he was outraged, as he believed that Isabella and Ferdinand's arranged marriage was still valid, despite their broken alliance. As punishment for going against his father's wishes, Charles was thrown in prison and would later die in 1461. This, however, wouldn't be the last time that Isabella was forced to marry off to other men that didn't last long. In a way, John was correct in how Isabella and Ferdinand were destined to be together, but it would take years for them to actually meet each other in person, let alone get married. Isabella would later get betrothed to Alfonso V of Portugal, who just so happened to be Henry's brother-in-law, but she was understandably wary of the impending marriage and refused to go through with it. It also didn't help that around the time, Henry IV's incompetence would show due to more civil wars occurring as a result of his inability to properly rule. Once again, Henry tried to get Isabella to marry in order to ensure his political power and appease the rebels by betrothing her to Pedro Giron Acuna Pacheco. Had this marriage been successful, Henry would have become wealthy due to Pedro promising to pay a large sum of money for the royal treasury. Again, Isabella refused and even prayed to God to help her escape from this fate. Her prayers were answered when Pedro suddenly fell ill and died while on his way to meet her. Thus, another attempt at marrying sister off had failed, and it seemed as though this would be the end of his schemes to gain political allies through his sister. Though Henry claimed that he would stop forcing her to marry random suitors for his own political gain and would grant her his consent to marry whoever she deemed worthy, he would later break that promise by trying to betroth her to Alfonso V of Portugal yet again, after the latter offered to marry Isabella. It also didn't help that Henry would also try to marry Isabella off to Charles, Duke of Berry, in order to remove her from his political affairs for good. This would be the last straw for Isabella, as she could no longer trust her brother to keep his promises, and decided to take matters into her own hands by going back to the original plan made for her, which was to marry Ferdinand of Aragon. And this is where their story really began, and things got more interesting. Realizing that her chances of being gotten rid of by Henry due to her shrewd intellect making him feel threatened, Isabella resolved to go through with marrying Ferdinand despite Henry and the Catholic Church's objections. It also helped that Ferdinand also went through similar political strife when it came to his family, as his older brother and father were constantly at each other's throats, and his father was seen as widely unpopular by the other nobles. When Ferdinand's older brother died by mysterious circumstances, Ferdinand was made the heir to the throne, which gave Isabella the perfect opportunity to deem him worthy of marriage and finally escape her half-brother's grip over her life. It also helped that Ferdinand was very loyal to his father, hence why he automatically became his father's heir over his brother, and had experience in the military as a lieutenant in his father's army. Once Ferdinand and his father discovered Isabella's willingness to go through with the original plan, they both agreed to help her, with Ferdinand accepting Isabella as his fiancée. It was, after all, the only way to properly unite their families and become the key to saving Spain from total collapse under Henry's rule. With John II and Ferdinand on her side, Isabella was able to set in stone her own future without her brother's interference. Isabella and Ferdinand would then meet each other in secret, with Ferdinand disguising himself as a servant so he wouldn't get caught, and were said to have sent each other secret messages to keep in touch according to plan. They would meet each other a few days before the proper marriage, with the blessing of Ferdinand's father, and in order to escape from her brother once and for all, while also finding an excuse to rendezvous with Ferdinand in Valladolid, Isabella claimed to Henry that she was visiting their other brother's tomb, Isabela, to pay her respects, as they had a brother named Alfonso who died years ago. Not realizing what was happening, Henry allowed her to go, thus indirectly freeing Isabela and allowing her to elope with Ferdinand in Valladolid. Though there were complications regarding the legality of their marriage due to the couple being distant cousins, the matter of having a papal dispensation was urgent. The matter was solved when Ferdinand's father, along with the future Pope Alexander VI, or aka Rodrigo de Borja, gave the dispensation through a potentially forged document, thus allowing the union to be legal in their eyes. The wedding ceremony was relatively small, but hey, that's what happens with elopements in general. No sooner had they finally gone married did things finally change, and quite possibly for the better, of Spain. A treaty was made between Castille and Aragon, with Isabella being made queen and Ferdinand being her consort instead of the other way around. You could say Isabella was the one who wore the pants in the relationship. But anyways, Castile would end up being formally superior to Aragon, but their alliance would allow them to finally put an end to the Catalan civil war, which was tearing the country apart. The moment Henry IV discovered what his sister had done, he was furious and decided to disinherit her in favor of his own daughter, Joanna, which was ironic considering how he initially planned that Isabella become his successor after his death up until this point. Because of this, Joanna and her supporters ended up fighting for the throne against Isabella and Ferdinand, with Joanna's husband, who turned out to be none other than Alfonso V of Portugal, aided her in what would become known as the War of the Castilian Succession. Thanks to Isabella and Ferdinand's propaganda campaign providing them with more supporters compared to Joanna, whose scandalous marriage to Alfonso and her father's reputation made her deeply unpopular in the public's eyes, they slowly managed to win the war, especially with Alfonso finally deciding to call it quits when he was unable to get France to help him fight against Isabella and Ferdinand, along with the Pope ironically reversing the dispensation regarding Alfonso's marriage to Joanna, who was his niece, by the way. As a result, Alfonso, along with various other monarchs, signed a treaty with Isabella and Ferdinand, known as the Treaty of Alcacovas, that would renounce their claims to each other's kingdoms instead of future expansion through the future marriage between Alfonso's son, Prince Alfonso of Portugal, to Isabella and Ferdinand's daughter, Princess Isabela of Asturias. I guess you could say, in the end, Henry IV did get what he wanted, which was to have an Isabella marry an Alfonso, but probably not in the way he thought. Finally, after years of civil wars and political drama between nobles, Isabella and Ferdinand were able to put an end to it all and ensure that Spain would finally be united and gradually become more stable for years to come. Now, I know what you're thinking. This doesn't sound very romantic at all due to the various politics that were involved in this particular union, but keep in mind that had it not been for him, Spain would most likely have fallen apart to the point of becoming extinct entirely, and by all accounts, they were said to have had quite the stable and happy marriage despite being political partners. Chances are they might have genuinely shared a romantic connection with each other over time, so who knows. You could say that this is what would have happened if, say, Niccolo Machiavelli had written Romeo and Juliet instead of Shakespeare, and by extension, Richard Total. Or better yet, this is what would have happened had Friar Lawrence's plan to unite both houses actually worked. Either way, it was their union that ultimately helped Spain in the long run, though it took a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to make it work out in the end.